There's been a flurry of statements in the UK over the past 2 days suggesting that we're about to get a lot more involved in Iraq. But what are the aims of the Western intervention, and is there really a strategy behind it? Joining me is my colleague James Blitz. James, why in this, what appears to be late in the game, is David Cameron suggesting that there's going to be a longer-term intervention now?
Well, it's not really clear. I mean, a week ago, what Cameron and the British government were saying was that they would only participate in a kind of very limited humanitarian operation to assist the Yazidi and Christian populations who were being isolated by ISIS, the Islamic State group, the jihadist group, which is threatening them and potentially carrying out a genocide. And then, in fact, what happened was the US decided it wouldn't go ahead with that humanitarian operation. But now suddenly Cameron and his Defence Minister Michael Fallon are saying, no, we're actually thinking of doing something much more substantial, coming alongside the US in a more targeted set of operations against ISIS.
Do we know what kind of operations? Are we talking about airstrikes here,
We don't
for
know.
example?
That's, I think, where part of the confusion is. They've moved from this position of saying humanitarian to airstrikes, potentially, but they're still not saying exactly what it is. So one's left being uncertain what the UK is about in all this. Is
the Prime Minister sort of catching up to what the US has been doing? Do you think he's been part of the discussion about what the Americans have been up to in Iraq?
I think he's been part of the discussion, but I think the difficulty for the British is that they clearly want to do something. They're a NATO ally of the US and so on. But the US is in the lead here. There's no question about that. The US has a major presence in Iraq, still in Baghdad. It has a big presence in Erbil. It's very much the lead operator here. And I think that the British aren't, like other allies, completely sure how this is going to evolve, whether the US is going to go into something much more sustained against ISIS. And so I think what's happening is that Cameron, not quite knowing how things are going to pan out, is basically saying to the British public, it may be possible, and I'm preparing you for the possibility of something more sustained.
And do you think arming the Kurds, this is part of a strategy? And do you feel that there is any coordination between all the Western allies about how to handle armaments of arming the Kurds?
At the moment, no, there isn't. I think that is the part of the picture which is least clear. And I think if that were to go ahead, it would, of course, give the Kurds, for example, a much more substantial possibility of becoming an independent state. So that side of things is as yet unclear.
And do you feel that enough progress has been achieved so far? Like over the last couple of weeks, we've had a change of government of the Prime Minister in Baghdad, and that was thought to be quite an important moment. And the airstrikes seem to have halted ISIS's advances.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. And it'd be interesting to hear what you think as well. Certainly the removal of Maliki has been very important in terms of trying to move Iraq towards a more all-encompassing approach rather than the sectarian Shia one of Maliki. And at the same time, clearly ISIS has been stopped in terms of taking over some big strategic assets. But even so, I would have thought there was quite a lot more to do. And I think an important issue is to what extent Arab countries are going to come on board potentially and help the Americans out. That's one of the big questions people are asking.
There does seem to have been a bit of a shift amongst the Gulf states in the last week or so, just towards more support for a tougher hand in dealing with ISIS. But do you get the sense that this is going to be a very long-term? What can be achieved, and what is the objective here? Is it to destroy ISIS? Is it to keep ISIS within a very small geographic space in Iraq?
It's really unclear, and the US has not spelled out beyond the somewhat limited statement President Obama made at the start about protecting the humanitarian protection of ethnic groups and the protection of US citizens. My own view is that if they are really going to create the possibility for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi government in Baghdad to try and retake parts of the country that have been lost, they are going to have to degrade ISIS assets on the ground.
One last thing. Do they also have to degrade ISIS assets on the ground in Syria and not only in Iraq? And how does that play within the current conflict in Syria?
Well, of course, that would be an incredibly difficult step for the US and its allies to take, because by degrading ISIS assets on the ground in Syria, one, they're intervening in Syrian airspace, which they haven't done, and two, potentially that is an important lift for Assad. So my guess is that although ISIS looks like it's wanting to try and regain Aleppo, and Cameron made reference to this, I would be really surprised if you saw Western intervention there at this point.
Thank you, James.